Thank you so much, David, and thank you and to the Royal Society of Edinburgh for hosting us. I'm very grateful, and thank you all for coming. So great to see so many people from all over the world and a lot of people who have helped us in this revision process.
What I'd like to do today is talk about the research base, but also more than that, the revision process, which involved a lot of testing at the clinical level as well as the research level, and the thinking that we had about version 3, what we wanted to accomplish. So I'll start off by talking a little bit about the growth of HCR-20 research more broadly, just to kind of set the stage about what we've learned so far about the HCR-20 system, which will lead us to asking why do we want to revise it. And a lot of that was addressed by Stephen. Our goals for the revision, the process of this revision. I'll tell you what the version 3 risk factors are. You'll get the manual later today. The clinical and research support that underpins version 3. And finally, what we'll do is end up with some recommendations for how version 3 might be evaluated by anybody here who is interested in evaluating the HCR-20. So let's start in 1995. 1995, as Steve pointed out, was the publication of the first version of the HCR-20. In 1996, just a year later, the first 4 studies were published. Sorry, not published, were completed. Now, these were master's theses and conference presentations at the time. 1997, version 2 was published, and in 1998 was the first published article. And does anybody here know who published the first article? The good Professor Belfrock did. First published article. In the 2000s, there literally was an explosion of research on the HCR-20. And that has brought us to today, where this will be the formal day on which version 3 is published. Just a little bit of information about how much has been done on the HCR-20. So there have been approximately 200 disseminations, so that is conference presentations and articles, based on 150 data sets, so independent data sets, spanning 35 different countries. And a lot of the people who have done some of that research are here today. There have been 20 translations of the HCR-20. And a recent survey by Jay Singh of about 2,100 clinicians across 44 different countries found that the HCR-20 was the most commonly used violence risk assessment instrument. This is a breakdown of the settings in which the HCR-20 research has been conducted. You can see about half in forensic settings, but quite a bit also in correctional or prison settings, as well as mixed settings. So there's some studies which evaluate the performance across, say, both forensic and civil psychiatric patients. A bit of a smaller proportion in general psychiatry or civil psychiatry. And finally, as Steve has mentioned as well, some in juvenile justice settings. These topics have spanned primarily these 4 areas. So a lot of the early foundational work, in fact, Henrik's first publication on this topic was on the inter-rater reliability of the HCR-20. And there was a number of studies looking at whether clinicians could agree with one another on the risk factors, and also what we call the concurrent validity of the HCR-20. How did it relate to things like the psychopathy checklist or other risk assessment instruments? A lot of research obviously is focused on the association between the risk factors and violence, and more recently, and there's not been as many studies, but still a good number, on risk ratings. So those structured professional judgment ratings of low, moderate, high risk that you're also familiar with have now become a common topic of research. And there's also been some studies looking at the concept of dynamic risk. This is a very important part of the SPJ model. We presume that a lot of the risk factors on not only the HCR-20 but other SPJ instruments can change over time so that they can mark treatment progress. And there's been a number of studies on that topic of dynamic risk as well. What I'd like to do is just give you a couple of examples of some of this research, just so that we all have a context of what we know about version 2 of the HCR-20. Because one of the things that we really wanted to accomplish with version 3 was to try to build on the knowledge base of version 2. So we didn't want to make it so dramatically different that we had to kind of start from scratch in terms of evaluation. So Laura Guy conducted a meta-analysis of the SPJ literature more broadly, so 166 independent SPJ studies. She was able to look more specifically at instrument-specific performance. So there's quite a bit of information that we learned about the HCR-20 based on that meta-analysis. She also was able to look at comparing the numeric ratings of the risk factors. So if we just look at how many risk factors are present, comparing that index to the summary risk ratings, the clinician's judgment, which is how in practice we recommend that the instrument is used. And she was able to look at a number of moderators as well. So whether things like gender and country influence the predictive accuracy of the HCR-20. So what she found, in fact, was that if you look at the top row here, these are what we call areas under the curve, just a statistical index. The closer to 1, the better. So these are moderate to large strength effect sizes. With antisocial behavior generally as the outcome, the summary risk ratings perform as well as if you just add up the risk factors. Okay? And if you look when violence is used as the outcome, in fact, those judgments of low, moderate, and high risk do a little bit better than if you just add up the risk factors. And this is getting at a little bit of what Steve was talking about, putting the pilot back into the cockpit and into the process. So when we bring clinicians into the mix, the decision-making mix, we actually see that they're better able to forecast who may or may not be violent than if we were just to add up the risk factors. A couple of notes here. In Laura's meta-analysis, there was no moderation by gender, setting, or country. So by setting, I mean forensic psychiatric versus corrections, inpatient versus community violence. That is, the HCR-20 did about the same across all these various different potential moderators. And similarly, there's been a number of studies that have found that the structured risk ratings of low, moderate, high actually add incrementally to the numeric use. So not only do they perform a little bit better, but once you have everything in the mix, it's the summary risk ratings which tend to do most of the actual prediction, statistically, of violence. And there's been a number of other meta-analyses as well. We don't have to get into the guts and details of all of them, but in the last few years there's been at least 5 that have shown that the HCR-20 does as well as any other instrument out there. And there's been a couple also that have shown that it adds incrementally to the psychopathy checklist. That was actually one of the big questions that we faced in the early days about the HCR-20, given that on version 2 and version 1, the PCLR, or screening version, was part of the HCR-20. People would always ask, well, does the HCR-20 actually add anything on top of the PCLR? And in fact, we're at the point now of having meta-analyses that show that in fact it does. And just a little bit of detail on one particular meta-analysis by Yang et al. In 2010. And they looked at 9 different instruments, including the psychopathy checklist instruments, across 28 different studies that use more than one measure. And they compared all these different measures to the psychopathy checklist. And so what I'm going to show you next actually is a lot of information, but I'll point out what you should be looking at. And I kind of do this for a reason. Yeah, so just look in the top right corner. Okay, those are correlations. And you can see the HCR-20 and a couple of other instruments have correlations in about the 0.3s, with the PCL being kind of in the middle range. probably the most important thing from this study is that over a series of different analyses, it was only the HCR-20 and one other instrument, which is actually used in the UK, the Fender Group Reconviction Scale, that added incrementally to the PCL. So this was, again, meta-analytic evidence that there's some further benefit to using the HCR-20 above and beyond the psychopathy checklist. The other important topic which I wanted to touch on before we move on to version 3 is this idea of dynamic risk, and that is, are we able to show whether or not risk factors on the HCR-20 change, and if so, are those changes related to violence? So first thing I will show you is a football. Why am I showing you a football? What do you notice about it? Observations? I know there's some insightful clinicians here. Don't get too deep though. It's round, right? When we think of a soccer ball, as we call it, a football, as you call it, they're round. But, you know, sometimes, as Steve said, shit happens. Soccer balls change shape. So what we're really interested in doing is being able to identify when risk factors are going to change shape. When are they going to change? So one of the first kind of simple studies on this was Henrik and I looked at the admission and discharge ratings on the C scale of the HCR-20 upon psychiatric admission and discharge to a hospital. And in blue here is just the distribution of the scores, which can go from 0 to 10, and at discharge in yellow. So we just see a shift down. Basically, people got better with treatment, which is what you want to see. More recently, we have a project based on patients from the Sundsvall Forensic Psychiatric Hospital, where Henrik is the director of research. And we looked at 174 patients at 4 different time intervals, and we were interested in whether the C scale showed any change over time, whether that change was related to violence, and then also whether we could identify subgroups of people who may change differently. So not everybody amongst a group of people will all change in the same way, right? Some people may get better, some people may get worse, some people may stay the same. So the first thing I'll show you is simply, on average, 174 people, 4 different time points, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is the C scale, which can go from 0 to 10 if you do add it up and use it for research purposes. And there's a drop over time. Now, it's not a very big drop. 5.7 to 5.1. But on average, we see a change. And we also see that if you measure the change between time 1 and time 2, that predicts violence after time 2. So people who got worse were more likely to be violent. People who got better, less likely to be violent. We're interested in this question of whether people change differently. That is, can we identify groups, subgroups of people with different patterns of change? So what we did is something called a cluster analysis, which is basically just a way to group individuals. And we used as clustering variables the C-scale scores at time 1, 2, 3, and 4 to see if we could find groups of people who showed different patterns of change. So I'm going to show you the 5 groups that we found. So this is the first group. This is a group of people, and you can see time 1, time 2, time 3, time 4. So this group of people started out kind of at the midpoint, and they actually got a little bit better. This group of people started out a little bit more high on the C scale, also got better. These folks kind of stayed low the entire time. These folks started out very high, about 9, 9.5. They showed some improvement, and this group actually got worse. So they started out quite high, they got worse, and then they tapered off and got a little bit better. So the next question that emerges is, well, so we found these groups of people who may change differently. Does their violence change kind of in lockstep with changes on the C scale? I'm just going to show you 2 more charts. And basically the pattern was, yes, indeed, they do. So the bars here is the percentage of violence. The line is the score on the C scale. And so you can see as the C scale decreased, violence tended to decrease in the next 6 months as well. This is the group that got a little bit worse. So you can see as their score increased, their violence tended to increase, and then it fell off as the score fell off. So that's just a bit of an indication that we can, in fact, use the HCR-20 to be able to identify change in dynamic risk factors, and that different people may change differently, and that seems to have some meaning in terms of what we can expect in terms of future violence. And the last thing I'll show you is a very recent study by Michel. Steve Hart is a co-author on this as well. 153 patients, both general and forensic psychiatric, followed every 6 months in the community this time. So the previous study was in the hospital, this is in the community. And they looked, in fact, at whether item level change predicts violence in the next 6-month block, okay? So they looked at each of the C and each of the R risk factors. And what I'll show you here is simply the arrows indicating which of the items, in fact, when they changed, were associated with violence. So for, in fact, 6 of the 10 items, when they increased, there was a corresponding increase in the observed violence. When they decreased, a corresponding decrease in observed violence. So again, this is just essentially support for the basic assumption of the SBJ model that we want to try to change these risk factors, and when they do change, we see corresponding change in risk. So what we've learned from the HCR-20 so far, as well as other SPJ instruments, is that they are as, if not more strongly related to violence than other measures. That professionals' judgments, so when used by clinicians to make decisions, that adds incrementally to the numeric use, not only of the instruments themselves, but of other instruments too, be it the PCLR, actuarial instruments. It works comparably across countries and across continents, for men, for women. It's sensitive to change, and those changes tend to predict violence. This is what we have learned, and it's supportive of the HCR-20 model. So it leads to the question, why change it? It seems to be doing okay. I would argue that at a very basic level, things change. So in the mid-1990s, we were very focused on what are the right risk factors? What are the right risk factors? Since that time, as Steve laid out very well, there's been many conceptual developments, and those have been incorporated into other SBJ instruments, as well as into how we recommend the HCR-20 is used, but they weren't incorporated yet into the manual itself. So we wanted to bring those things into the manual. There have been about 2,500, if not more, studies published just on the topic of violence since version 2 came out in 1997. And it would be silly to think that we couldn't possibly learn something more about violence based on those studies. We didn't really expect to discover brand new risk factors, but we did think that there may be slightly different ways to categorize them or to revise them if need be. As I mentioned, a lot of conceptual developments, and we just learned over the years how the HCR-20 could be better. Between the various authors on the HCR-20, we've talked to many, many people through trainings and workshops and whatnot. A lot of feedback that we received was consistent across countries and across trainers and whatnot that seemed to us to converge on certain different potential weaknesses with the HCR-20, which we wanted to address. And that's, I guess it just reflects a more general point, which Chris really started in 1993 when he started this whole SPJ model, was that there should be really a grassroots element to it. And so a lot of how each of the HCR-20s have been developed has been through consulting with people who do risk assessment on a daily basis. So what we wanted to do in terms of the development, we wanted to retain the emphasis and the reliance upon clinical judgment, the link to management and treatment, and this concept of dynamic risk. These are really foundational elements of SPJ and the HCR-20. We wanted to enhance how the HCR-20 could be used to make decisions about individuals. A lot of that has to do with risk formulation, scenario planning, which Steve had talked about. And we also were interested in improving the quality with which we measured the risk factors. And that had to do with how we define them and a couple of the new features of the HCR-20, which I'll talk about now. So we have increased formulation. These are the primary changes. I'll just give you the kind of thumbnail sketch of some of the primary changes, some of which Steve had talked on. So an increased focus on formulation, the inclusion of relevance ratings. We also have brought in item indicators, and I'll give you an example of that. This is one way in which we're trying to encourage or facilitate people thinking about how risk factors might manifest at the individual level for a given patient, client, or offender. Summary risk ratings of serious and imminent violence. So for those of you familiar with the current HCR-20, all we say is think about whether somebody's at risk for violence, generally, at some point, of some kind in the future. We don't get any more specific than that. But we thought in a lot of contexts, people need to be thinking about different forms of violence, whether somebody's at risk to commit serious physical harm, and to do so sooner rather than later. We did make a number of item changes. There are some new items on version 3. There are some items that are no longer with us, and there's some items that have been merged with others or split apart. I'll give you a little bit of an overview of that. One thing we did, Steve did mention that we kept 20 items, and we actually, this was a source of some conversation. What are we going to do if we think there should be 22 items? We're going to ruin the name. So we have sub-items. So we have 20 items, some of which are split into 2 or to 3, but we didn't split them far enough that we thought they should be distinct items. So it really turns out the way the universe does work is 20 is the right answer. The psychopathy checklist revised or screening version is no longer required. As you know, it's a requirement in version 2. It's no longer a requirement. Part of that is on the basis of showing that the HCR-20 can work, in fact, well without it. Part of that is to reflect the development of new and emerging measures of psychopathy. We didn't want people to feel trapped to use just one given instrument. Oh, there might be something called the, what is it, the CAP? Yes. That has a lot of growing research in its support. And so we no longer require this. However, if you want to still use it, you can. So if people are still interested in using the PCLR as part of the HCR-20, you can do that. We had a number of guiding principles for the HCR-20 revision process. So we wanted to enhance it conceptually and clinically. So this meant clarifying item definitions, the assessment procedure. There's not a lot of detail in the version 2 manual about assessment procedures in particular. Another guiding principle was that empirically, of course, it had to have some level of acceptable reliability and validity, and that basically we didn't make it worse. We had agreed at the beginning that we just really didn't want to make it worse. If it does as well as the current HCR-20, we're okay with that because there's so many added features that we think improves it. And then legally, we wanted it to be acceptable as well. So that meant not including certain risk factors which may be objectionable on their face, ethnicity, race, so forth. So how did we go about this? People have asked us, when did you start revising the HCR-20, right? And David, evidently you think it was about 10 years ago. Is that right? Okay. Now, one thing I actually learned, evidently, I guess when Steve was asked when will the HCR-20 be done, he would say 2 years. I'm actually really surprised that you gave a quantitative estimate as your answer. I would just say soon, because that answer is always right. When will it be ready? Soon. In fact, I can even say that now. When will it be ready? Soon, this afternoon, right? So we had a number of procedures that we went through. A lot of it was internally. We've been talking about this for years. We had also asked a number of people to just give us their feedback on version 2. How could we improve version 2? What areas of difficulty do you see? And our own kind of internal dialogue as well. We thought it would be important to have clinical testing of version 3, and a lot of the people who actually have done that clinical testing, as I'll point out, are here today. We call this beta testing, so basically taking the draft version 3 manual for a test ride, trying it out with patients, trying it out with offenders, seeing how it works, how does it feel. This is consumer satisfaction when we're thinking of clinicians as consumers of risk assessment. So we wanted to make sure that clinicians would be satisfied with the product. And then, of course, we were interested in empirical evaluations, and again, a number of the folks who have been involved in version 3 pilot testing are also here today, and as well as a number of folks who have done version 2 testing over the years as well. So I'll tell you also about empirical evaluation.